In this video, we're going to look at polarization and division in Canada. We know that Canada is less polarized than the electorate in America, in general terms. America does seem to be polarized a lot more than Canada, and research has affirmed that. Research by Eric Merkley and Andrew Parkman and Environics, they both showed that polarization in the Canadian electorate is not as extreme as in the American electorate. However, that's not to say that there isn't still division in the electorate in Canada. Start by just thinking about polarization. When we talk about polarization in the electorate, we are typically talking about that left-right ideological scale and where people fall on that. When we think about a polarized electorate, like in the United States, we think of large groups clustered around the extreme poles, with not many folks in the middle. That's what we think about when we talk about a polarized electorate. The electorate in Canada does not quite look like that. In order to look at that, it's important to consider another dimension. So when we think about the left-right axis, we're talking about ideas about how you think the economy and society should be organized. Do you want a more individualist or more collectivist? Do you want to see more equality, or do you want to allow for more individual choice and inequality? But there's another axis to consider as well, and that's your attitudes about the state. What do you think state power should be used for? And the two poles, we could describe them as authority versus liberty. How to think about this? Well, in the middle of that spectrum would be most people. Most people would sort of at the end of an election might think, you know what, I'm not happy about these results, but I accept the outcome of the process. Now, there are some extremes along that continuum. For example, people on the extreme liberty or libertarian part of it might be, I don't care what you do, I don't care about what anyone else does, I just don't want the government to tell me what to do. I also don't want the government to tell you what to do. I don't think the government should be telling anybody what to do at all. That's the sort of extreme libertarian outlook. However, at the other extreme would be, I must get my way at all costs. My way must be enforced, perhaps violently, and the state power should be used to punish my political opponents. And so within that, we've got a much more complex view of the electorate, because it's not just about how you want society and the economy to be organized, but how you want power to be wielded. And this is where some research by Frank Graves and Jeff Smith indicate that the divide in Canada might be growing. It might be growing due to a contingent of the Canadian electorate that is growing much more authoritarian in their outlook. They call it ordered populism, or an ordered authoritarian outlook. And what this outlook does, people that espouse this view tend to emphasize order, there's hostility to outgroups, it's very reactionary in nature, and there's a preference for kind of like a dictatorial leader. They argue that that attitude is growing in Canada. And it's not really true polarization, but it is division based around this ordered authoritarian outlook. Here's how it looks like according to their data. There's a few extreme pockets of views, but generally most Canadians tend to agree on most things. They break it down to about a 70-30 division. Most Canadians tend to agree on fundamental values and principles about the democratic process. However, they argue that there's a growing, perhaps around 30% of the electorate that is becoming much more authoritarian in their outlook. And so rather than true polarization with large groups at each end, this is a more asymmetric polarization where most of the people have stayed in the same spot, but a faction has started to grow more extreme. There's some evidence for this in research by ECOS. ECOS Research has done some public opinion polling on this, especially around things like the convoy protests and COVID-19 vaccination. Here is an example visually in terms of a question that was asked about support for the convoy protests in February 2022. The top line is the sort of national picture where the blue is opposition and the green is support. Again, it's about that 70-30 breakdown, where about 70% of the people oppose the idea of blockading borders and occupying cities, where about 25% or so is in favor of it. On the surface, that's a pretty big divide, but when you get down by party identification, the division becomes much more stark. We can see that this sentiment very popular in supporters of the People's Party and a majority of Conservative Party supporters. And so this tends to validate that idea of growing authoritarianism that is divided by party preference. So just to recap, the American electorate is pretty polarized in terms of that left-right spectrum. We've got large groups at each end. Canada, the picture is a little different. However, Canada still has division. The divide is more asymmetric, and it's not really along the right-left lines, but how you view the power of the state. There is a growing authoritarian sentiment that is driving the division in Canada.